This is another client who came to see me, devastating. They're mostly fat inside of their muscles. And interesting, in the past, I think it's about a year and a half, AI detected that if you have fatty muscle replacement in a certain threshold of that, you have double the risk of mortality compared to an obese person.
Dr. Sean O'Mara, our muscles can actually hold fat. We actually get this marbling in our muscle. And you were the one that told me about this originally. And I find it fascinating because I don't think people realize that we start to store fat in our muscle tissue. And what does that look like? What happens there? Is it good fat? Is it a bad fat? How do we get rid of it?
Yeah, great question. So it is a bad fat. It's better thought of as muscle replacement, fatty muscle replacement. So this fat starts to be laid down in your muscle tissue, and it really marbleizes your muscles in the same way you might see a steak that's marbleized. So an example I like to give is actually show an example of just steak. And this is where, I first, most people see it, and I first saw it, is this fatty deposition within the flesh of the animal. And so this is a cow that has been fed grass and grass finished. This is a cow that's been fed green. And pretty typically within the industry, they'll increase the carbohydrates. So most recently, it's fascinating. It's not just grain and corn and soy that's fed these animals, but now I think it was California, Drew Pruitt actually brought this story to my attention. A cattle feed truck tipped over on a highway, and when the cattle feed spilled, mixed in the feed were Skittles, human candy. So they're adding it into veterinarian agricultural, cattle feed to increase the amount of weight in that animal. And this is what happens to it. So you get this deposition. So this is alarming. And we started to, I got this insight about this muscle fat years ago in our study for the National Science Foundation, because we were working with NFL players. And so we were scanning older people and younger people. And what we noticed is the younger people, when we do MRI scans, didn't have as much of this marbleization in their muscles. The older people did.
After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT Electrolytes. They are not sweetened with erythritol. LMNT Electrolytes are 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium. But that link down below gets you a free sample variety pack with any purchase of LMNT Electrolytes. So whether you purchase their sparkling, whether you purchase their stick packs, or whatever, you get a free sample variety pack, and that's exclusively using my link down below. That is drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Again, drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Really interesting stuff. They curb my appetite entirely, but I also have them in a fasted state, and I sip on them during my fasted workouts because I feel like I actually get replenished, but I also get my cravings satisfied. So that link is down below in the description.
And so I had to work through, well, is this something that just happens with old age, or is this really a disease, and what the process is? And what we found is the correlation that this muscle fat has to visceral fat. And so the amount of white that you have in the middle in your abdomen corresponds to the amount of fat that you have in your muscles. And then look at the legs. So now every client who comes to me and works with our practice and our other physicians, we scan their legs. And so this individual here, his visceral fat is almost nothing. It's that little bit right there. And you see that little bit right there. So this is the core. This is the gold standard for a human being. This is the single best MRI scan I've seen in my lifetime, my medical career. And the reason is, look how pristine his muscles are. Look how big they are. I mean, those are massive muscles. His core look like birch trees inserted in there. So a guy like you with a nice figure would probably be saying, well, okay, there's the gauntlet, the challenge thrown down there. He's got this big core, and you see they're kissing. His core is kissing his abdominis rectus. Yeah. Now, this individual's core is like miles separation, because of all that visceral fat. And so you really want to have these pristine, nice muscles free of myosteatosis, free of fatty replacement of the muscle. And you want to have just a little bit of visceral fat. So his legs are beautiful. He doesn't have the fatty infiltration that this guy has. And this becomes, looks like Wagyu beef, but it can be very pathogenic. Like look at this individual here. This is another client who came to see me, devastating. They're mostly fat inside of their muscles. And interesting, in the past, I think it's about a year and a half, AI detected that if you have fatty muscle replacement, a certain threshold of that, you have double the risk of mortality compared to an obese person. So imagine that. If the average person has an awareness that obesity leads to both a shorter lifespan and also a poor quality of life, just wrap your head around the fact that if you have this going on, it's even twice. Now, this person actually has a condition called SMA, spinal muscle atrophy. So their muscles are atrophying. Now, this is 3 months later. We've actually, in this area here, we've increased their muscle growth. So we're actually first radiographic indication of SMA improving. And the first time in history that I'm aware of an example of that, by targeting their visceral fat and helping to eliminate that. So, but returning again to these, to this skein here, I think it's really important to be aware of how much that visceral fat aligns with this muscle fat, and use the term before, human Wagyu. This is like Wagyu beef. Now, I am so fascinated by the meat as a food source because when I work with clients, the thing that eliminates visceral fat is getting on a meat-centric diet. When vegans show up to me, they have more elevated levels of visceral fat. Now, I will work with vegans. I do work with vegans, and I reduce both their muscle fat and their visceral fat through these strategies, but they do not reduce it as quickly as somebody who's on a meat-centric diet. So meat is the most nutritiously dense, gram for gram. The highest amount of nutrition available is through meat. So in my practice, we advocate a meat-centered diet to help people with that. But we follow people. We do MRIs to track that myosteatosis, visceral fat within them, and we can get them improved. But this Wagyu beef, I'm so interested in what's happening to our food source, meat, that I will look at your eye and say, I'm considering, my wife hopefully doesn't see this, I'm considering going to veterinary school. Because guess what? They have the same problem in veterinary medicine that we have in allopathic medicine. And what that problem is, our system, our educational system, medical school, is devoid of educating physicians how to improve the health of people. Instead, we educate them how to treat disease, which is completely different. So the veterinarians do the same thing. Veterinarians treat disease. They don't go to veterinary medical school to learn how to make make animals more healthy. They learn to earn a living and to make money. It's fascinating to me. So these veterinarians, go to a veterinarian school, and they're not learning how to optimize those animals. And that's an important source of food. So I'm interested potentially going back to veterinarian school and to learn veterinary science to improve our source of food for our species.
Interesting.
It would be somewhat sacrificial, but I would enjoy it. I'm fascinated by, our food source. And here's the interesting thing with Wagyu beef. I can't find any videos. I'm sure there existence, but I just can't find them about Wagyu cattle. I've been told by people that raise it and have been a part of the industry, they can barely stand. Does that sound good? They can barely stand. And here's the interesting thing. When I study them, do you know they can't fornicate? They can't reproduce. So what they have to do within this breed of cattle is to take, bovine semen and bovine eggs and do in vitro fertilization. So they combine those two in a test tube. But here's what's really interesting. What do they do with that fertilized embryo? They don't put it back into a Wagyu cattle. And the reason is they're so diseased that enough of them won't make it to gestation to make it profitable. So it's a business to make money. So what do they do with that? They put it into a different breed of cattle, a healthier breed of cattle. So they put it into Charmaines, because if they put it back into a Wagyu cow, that embryo either won't make it, or the cow won't survive, or the baby won't survive in the birthing. So these cattle are so sick, they can't reproduce. They can't. They have a terrible quality of life, and everything. When you read about it, it's like the goal is to increase more disease, more biomerization. This one website, this guy is a consultant for the Wagyu beef industry. He kept saying this over again: keep your eye on the prize, and the prize is more marbleization. Now you already know that is disease. So literally, the prize within the Wagyu beef industry is disease. And guess what? That disease is rewarded. A premium in pay. Can you imagine that? Get your head around it, Thomas. You are end up paying over $100 a pound for diseased flesh, and the consumers are lining up, like crazy, buying this. Now, what does this remind me of? Cholesterol. Mm-hmm. The consumer is buying into, you got a lower cholesterol, and meanwhile, it's highly profitable. So the bottom line is Homo sapiens don't know what to pay attention to, what to really follow. And that's why I love your show, and I love other influencers in the social media space, because they're challenging the conventional paradigm of what you got to do to be healthy. There's so much more. And that's why these shows are so critical to get this information out. So muscle fat is bad in an animal, and it's bad within human beings. And that correspondence is so prevalent once you start looking at disease in humans and MRIs to take a look at that. You couldn't see it from the outside, but you could infer it, because how this individual walks, they had to take 2 swings to get up out of my couch when they were doing their consultations to get up. And but they're only in their early 50s, and they'll never make it to their 70s without avoiding a walker, if they even make it, if they don't drop dead of a heart attack sooner.
It's interesting. I can't remember his name. The gentleman that it's I think a Russian guy. The gentleman that brought the kettlebell over from Russia to the United States.
I forget his name too.
Pavlov or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And this has come up so many times in the last few interviews, and I heard it from Bill Maeda. I hadn't heard this quote from him before, but basically when he was asked about what meat he eats, he said, "What about chicken?" He goes, "I don't eat chicken. It's a weak bird." And the reason that I say that is because truly, in the very simple sense, we are what we eat. And it's kind of funny because ancestrally, and we're going to get to the tips and how to reduce this myosteatosis in a minute. But I think the ticket to it, as we've talked before in other episodes, is living somewhat ancestrally. How would right? And part of that is, I don't think that our ancestors would go and eat a diseased animal, right? So it's if they saw a sick creature that was dying, that would not be something maybe they were opportunistic, I don't know, but it seems like they would probably be energetically in tune enough to know that why would I put something that's diseased in my body, right? That just doesn't. So it kind of comes down to like, okay, these things, same thing with the Wagyu. And I've always kind of said this, not to toot my own horn, but there's something that had seemed instinctively off about very marbled meat to me. And I would always make a point of being like, opt for leaner cuts of meat. Like that was kind of my take, and be like, you're going to get animal fat in, that's fine. But like, don't elect to go choose this exceptionally fatty cut of meat because it seems like you're just eating an animal that had an unnormal amount of fat. And that just didn't seem right to me. Not to mention, even if we get down to a basic calorie discussion, it's difficult to determine how much you're getting in. Like you've got a very natural cut of meat that's maybe has a little bit of marbling and, a little bit of fat and ribbon of fat around it. And then you've got a piece that just looks unnatural. And if you were to look at, I've seen pictures of it, like what beef looked like in 1950 compared to what it looks like today, it looks entirely different. And that's just, 75 years. So I don't want to go too, tangential here.
No. But
I think there's something there.
Yeah.
I think there is something there.
Your intuition is spot on. Actually, it's recorded in history that, First Nation people, Native Americans, educated the white man when they showed up, our colonists, that they would hunt based on the silhouette, the shape of that animal, and the sheen of its coat, the fur on that animal. They would look for the healthiest one because it provided the greatest nutrition, to their people. And so they hunted the best animal. It was important to them as for their existence. So they did not hunt the weakest. Now, all other predators today, animals in the wild, hunt the weakest, the oldest, the youngest, the calf or something like that. But we had a cortex, Thomas. So we have the ability to analyze. Nature favors the organism that analyzes the best. So ancestrally, we would have paid attention to the need to hunt the very best animal in a herd because that nutritional value would bring. But the other interesting thing is the microbiome that would come from that animal was more superior. And they would skin that animal. And our ancestors paid attention when that skin was added to a human being, when it was a really healthy animal, it actually improved the human being. Yeah. But if you hunted a poor animal, to your point, like a sick one, it would have a more deficient microbiome and it would hurt the human who wore that skin. And so the need to hunt the very best is something that's been around for a long period of time. It is recorded in history. And today, we don't hunt the best animal. You go into a supermarket, you just hunt meat. We're educated the wrong way. We're getting Wagyu beef. But I go into Costco, if I'm traveling, like came out here, couldn't get access to grass-fed beef. I went to Costco and I selected the animal in that counter, and that refrigerated counter that had the lowest amount of Myosteatosis. And I said, that's the one that, I'm going to eat. And I got for my daughter. So we selected the very best meat from that counter. And I think your followers need to be that level, of intention. When they are looking at meat, you want to be getting a cut of meat that's less, that is going to have less Myosteatosis. And I'll go back to just for the example again that meat cut here, because I think it's really the most relevant photograph. This fat here is super good for you to eat.
Yeah, it's the ribbon. So there are good, healthy, so this is actually this is superficial subcutaneous fat on that animal. And but this fat around here is going to be more inflammatory because of the grain-fed diet and the stress. And by the way, they stress Wagyu beef to get more Myosteatosis. So pen them in. Don't let them go out into a pasture. Don't let them be parasympathetic. You want to increase the level of sympathetic stimulus to cause more disease in a sustained manner. Get them hotter, get them colder for longer. All these things will cause the industry to make more money. And meanwhile, the non-discerning consumer is buying this thinking that this is a good marbleized steak. But fortunately, if they're listening to Thomas DeLauer's
show they're learning otherwise, and they'll be more intentional about buying these animals.
What's interesting is that from a fatty acid standpoint, there might not be a lot of actual fatty acid difference between this and this, right? So there's going to be people that are going to watch and might say, and this is, again, like I'd probably be guilty of thinking this before learning some of this, and be like, okay, even though, I choose leaner cuts of meat from a fatty acid composition, well, once it's, masticated and digested and things like that, it's all the same fatty acids. But for me, I'm not thinking about the actual fat itself. I'm thinking about the metabolic state of that tissue around the fat, right? Because yes, that fat right there could be the same fatty acid, stearic acid, myristic acid, whatever combination, C15, C17, whatever fatty acid carbon chain, right? And like it's just like glucose. Sure, the same kind of glucose is going to do X, Y, Z. But I think what you're talking about is this means if this is happening, it's not about the actual fat itself. It's about the state in which the animal is in to elicit that response. And that would hypothetically mean, and I could theorize, that the meat is probably different quality. And also just, if we wanted to get woo-woo about it, even the energetic value of the meat is probably different, right? Like, I mean, for people that are more spiritual and looking at it like that, like, is that the meat that you want to consume? Like, and
no, I think you're exactly right, and I think it is really that impact on that meat, and collectively the lack of the less favorable nutritional profile as a consequence of it. And also, I think it's fair to ask, and I haven't seen any studies in that particular fat, how much inflammatory molecules are present in that compared to the muscle, the fat on the side of that muscle.
It's probably never been looked at. No one's ever.
I don't think it has.
Because I mean,
that's why I want to go to veterinarian school and start researching that. I don't think there's going to be big money in it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because like with humans, like we've now analyzed like the composition of visceral fat compared to subcutaneous fat, but I highly doubt that it's being done in animals. Like there's no, tabling that for a second, I've got one quick question, and then I want to just do rapid fire, just a few takeaways, because my audience is really smart and they usually are like, okay, well, how can I apply this? The first question I have, just before I forget, and it's coming back to visceral fat for just a second, is visceral fat just sort of a proxy for liver fat, or vice versa? Is liver fat sort of a proxy for visceral fat? Or do you think they kind of operate almost like autonomously? Like, are they somewhat different?
So great question. Hepatosteatosis, fatty liver disease, is downstream to visceral fat.
Okay. And before we wrap up this episode, just, real quick, within a couple of minutes, like what are a few takeaways that people can have for sort of reducing this visceral fat and myosteatosis? We talked about the visceral fat in another episode, but just, if we had to put it down to like 5 quick bullets, like what would you say?
Okay. So this guy's a couch potato and this guy's an Olympic sprinter. So maximum intensity exercise in a short period of time. Okay. This guy eats clean. He doesn't eat processed foods. Okay. So cutting out processed foods, and then a sauna, sunshine, and fasting would be the last one is fermented foods. For eating, the microbiome, to enhance your microbiome, because really health starts and finishes with your microbiome. So getting from more fermented foods, these living microbes that are traditional, right? They're just passed down from tradition, and the healthiest people have some kind of practice of eating fermented foods. And so many of these practices, sauna, same thing, heat shock proteins that get produced. So those would be my biggest recommendations to avoid this from happening, and to live this kind of a life where you have, less muscle fat, less visceral fat, less deep subcutaneous fat. So sprinting, eating meat with fermented foods, sunshine, sauna, and fasting. Fasting, I think, is a really beneficial way of optimizing elimination of harmful fat. And the other interesting thing is when you fast and you refeed, you increase your propensity, it's not been studied, but anecdotally in my clients, for superficial subcutaneous fat. And it doesn't come back in visceral fat or deep subcutaneous fat. It comes back in that superficial subcutaneous fat. That's why I think a lot of bodybuilders avoid fasting, because they get this layer of fat and then they don't have striations, can't see as much definition. But that's, my clients want to be as healthy as possible, not win bodybuilding competitions.
Yeah. No, agreed, man. Well, Dr. O'Mara, where can everyone find you?
Yeah, so best place to find me is on my website, DRSEANOMARA.com, or you can find me on another website, growingbetternotolder.com. And you can also find me on social media. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, X, all on the same handle, at DRSEANOMARA.com.
Perfect. Thanks, Doc.
All right, absolutely.